We found Bigfoot's lair. What's inside will leave you speechless. Damien Holbrook had always been a practical man. At 34, he had built a successful career as a geological surveyor, spending more time in the wild than most people did in their own backyards. He could tell the difference between a bear track and a deer print, identify birds by sound from 150 feet away, and never believed in anything he couldn't measure, classify, or explain through practical science. That made what happened over the next 48 hours in Olympic National Forest all the more terrifying. The morning of September 15 started like any other workday. Damien's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. in his modest farmhouse outside Port Angeles, Washington. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as he reviewed his survey maps one last time. His company, Northwest Geological Services, had hired him to conduct a mineral assessment in a remote section of the Hoh River Valley deep within the temperate rainforest, an area few people had ever visited. The client, a Seattle-based mining corporation, suspected the region contained significant copper deposits and needed a preliminary survey before investing in costly exploration equipment. Damien had done hundreds of similar surveys over the past decade. He'd worked everywhere, from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the deserts of Nevada and the swamps of Louisiana. The Olympic Peninsula held no mystery for him. He'd been there at least 20 times, knew the terrain, understood the weather patterns, and respected the dangerous wildlife that called the forest home. Black bears were common. Mountain lions posed the occasional threat, and the weather could turn dangerous without warning, but those were measurable risks, the kind that could be mitigated with solid preparation and common sense. He loaded up his Ford F-150 with all the usual gear: a core sampling drill, a handheld GPS unit, topographic maps sealed in waterproof cases, an emergency radio, a first aid kit, enough food for 3 days, and camping equipment designed for the rainforest's constant dampness. His rifle, a Springfield .30-06 that had once belonged to his father, was locked safely behind the driver's seat. Damien had never needed to use it against anything more dangerous than a rabid raccoon, but the Olympic wilderness demanded both respect and readiness. The drive from Port Angeles to the Hoh River entrance took about 2 hours over increasingly rough terrain. The last stretch wound through untouched old-growth forest along a long-abandoned logging road. Massive Douglas firs and Sitka spruces formed a canopy so dense that mid-morning light felt like twilight. Damien's truck jolted over exposed roots and deep puddles, the engine straining in low gear as the incline steepened. At 9:47 a.m., according to his field notes, Damien reached the end of the drivable road. A rusted gate blocked further vehicle access, marked by faded warning signs about uneven terrain and avalanche danger. Beyond the gate, an overgrown trail disappeared into the forest, winding northwest toward the secluded valley where his survey would begin. The nearest sign of civilization was the Hoh Ranger Station, 23 miles to the southeast. His cell signal had dropped an hour earlier. Slinging his 70-pound backpack over his shoulders, Damien began the long hike. The trail, nearly invisible after years of abandonment, followed an old logging route for the first 2 miles before narrowing into a single overgrown path that climbed steadily through dense underbrush. The forest here felt different, older, quieter, more primal. The trees soared upward, the silence was complete, and the air carried an earthy scent that seemed ancient and untamed. Moss draped from the branches like green curtains, muffling sound and giving the woods the atmosphere of a cathedral. October weather in the region was unpredictable. Morning fog filled the valley floor, cutting visibility to less than 50 feet in some places. The temperature hovered around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough for layers, but warm enough to make him sweat during the climb. His breath formed small clouds as he hiked, and condensation from the mist clung to his jacket and beard. By noon, he'd covered 6 miles and reached his first survey site. The GPS coordinates matched perfectly with his map, a small clearing where an old landslide had wiped out several acres of forest decades earlier. Young alders and elderberry shrubs had since taken root, forming a relatively open patch beneath the dense canopy. It was the ideal spot to begin core sampling. Damien set up his equipment methodically, following the same procedure he'd perfected over years of fieldwork. The portable drill had to be precisely positioned to collect usable samples, and the heavy gear meant everything needed to be right the first time. As he worked, he remained aware of the forest's ambient sounds, The distant tapping of a woodpecker, the faint rustle of small creatures in the brush, the occasional creak of a branch bending under its own weight. It was while setting up the second drill station that Damien noticed something unusual. On the edge of the clearing stood a massive red cedar, nearly 8 feet in diameter, with strange indentations scarring the trunk. The marks were about 7 feet long, spaced evenly apart, 4 deep grooves running parallel to each other like claw marks, each roughly an inch deep and as wide as human fingers. Damien stepped closer, running his hand over the scarred bark. The impressions were weathered but not ancient, perhaps a year old at most. They were far too high and too uniform to be from a black bear, which rarely leaves such deliberate markings. A mountain lion might scratch a tree, but never like this and never that high. Damien took several digital photos, carefully noting the dimensions and location in his field journal. In 15 years of surveying the wilderness, he had cataloged thousands of signs of wildlife. None of them matched what he was seeing now. Nightfall in the forest. The spacing of the marks suggested something with a handspan of nearly 18 inches, and the depth of the grooves hinted at immense strength. Damien made a mental note to ask the local rangers about regional wildlife when he returned to civilization. The afternoon passed uneventfully as he finished collecting core samples and began his preliminary analysis. The rock samples showed promising mineral content, especially copper sulfide, which could indicate a substantial deposit deep underground. He carefully labeled each specimen and logged the GPS coordinates for later reference. The work was methodical and familiar, demanding such intense focus that there was little room to dwell on the strange markings carved into the cedar. As dusk settled over the valley, Damien chose a campsite near a small stream about half a mile from the survey site. The spot offered flat ground for his tent, a clean water source, and enough open space for a safe campfire. Following the leave no trace principle, he set up camp with minimal environmental impact, stored his food in sealed containers, and picked a tent site that wouldn't disturb the vegetation. The sun slipped behind the canopy around 6:30 p.m., though the dense trees made it feel much darker, much earlier. Damien built a small fire using fallen, decayed wood he found nearby, just large enough to stay warm without attracting unwanted attention. The heat was a comfort after a long day of labor, and the soft crackle of burning wood added a peaceful rhythm to the deep stillness of the forest. He warmed up a simple dinner of dehydrated beef stew and instant coffee, eating as he reviewed his field notes from the day. The mineral samples looked promising enough to justify a full-scale geological survey, meaning a larger team and more sophisticated equipment would be needed. Still, as he wrote in his journal that night, his mind kept circling back to the strange claw-like impressions on the cedar tree. In all his years of fieldwork, he had never seen anything quite like them. Around 8 p.m., while washing his cooking gear in the stream, a sudden noise made him freeze mid-motion. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind his camp, not the random crack of falling wood, but something heavy, deliberate. Something big was moving through the trees. Damien stood motionless, listening. Black bears were common here, and an encounter at his campsite could quickly turn dangerous if handled carelessly. The sound came again closer, this time followed by a deep, rhythmic breathing, heavy and labored. Slowly, Damien reached for his flashlight. He switched it on and swept the beam across the tree line. The light cut about 30 feet into the undergrowth, revealing moss-covered logs and hanging branches, but nothing threatening. "Hey, get out of here!" he shouted, hoping to scare off whatever was approaching. Silence. The forest went completely still. No breaking branches, no breathing, no rustle of brush. Damien waited several minutes, the flashlight beam steady as he scanned the trees, before convincing himself it was probably just a deer or an elk moving through. Animals like that were easily spooked by human noise and usually bolted once challenged. Even so, the encounter left him uneasy. He double-checked his food storage, making sure nothing edible was left out to attract wildlife. Then he fed the fire for a bit more light and warmth before crawling into his tent, the rifle within easy reach. The sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, but sleep came slowly. He lay still, listening to every sound in the darkness beyond the thin fabric walls. Sometime around midnight, Damien woke to a new noise, one that brought him instantly, completely awake. Something was moving around his campsite, something big. He heard heavy footsteps circling the tent, deliberate, cautious, not trying to be silent, but not clumsy either. The gait was strange, not the four-footed shuffle of a bear, yet not quite human. The steps paused near his food containers, then moved toward where his backpack rested outside the tent. His heartbeat quickened. Quietly, Damien reached for the flashlight and rifle. Through the thin nylon wall, he saw a massive shadow pass by, blotting out the faint orange glow of the dying campfire. The shape was tall, much taller than a bear standing upright, and it moved with an unmistakably upright posture. For several minutes, whatever it was continued to prowl the perimeter of his camp, moving with a stealth surprising for something of its size. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the motion stopped. Damien waited in the dark, every muscle tense, straining to hear any clue about where the visitor had gone. The silence stretched on 5 minutes, then 10, maybe 20. It felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and Damien drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Dawn came with soft light filtering through the treetops and the cheerful chatter of birdsong. The footprints. When Damien stepped out of his tent the next morning, the campsite appeared untouched. His food containers were still sealed tight. His backpack sat exactly where he'd left it, and there were no obvious signs that anything or anyone had moved through the area overnight. He began to wonder if he'd imagined the whole encounter, or perhaps only heard a bear passing by from a safe distance. But as he prepared breakfast and started cleaning up camp, Damien discovered something that made his blood run cold. In the soft mud beside the stream, less than 10 feet from where he'd pitched his tent, was a footprint unlike anything he had ever seen. The print was enormous, about 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. It showed 5 distinct toes, each ending in what appeared to be a claw mark. The depth of the impression suggested a creature weighing several hundred pounds. Kneeling beside it, Damien snapped multiple photos from different angles, then placed his size 11 boot next to it for scale. The comparison was staggering. His boot looked like a child's shoe beside the massive track. The footprint was far too large and far too human-like to belong to any known animal in North America. The hind foot of a grizzly bear can reach a similar size, but the toe alignment was completely wrong, and grizzlies hadn't roamed Washington state in decades. A growing unease pressed at the edges of Damien's thoughts as he began searching the surrounding area for more signs. He soon found 3 additional prints, forming a rough trail that led from the forest's edge to the stream and back again. Each print was perfectly preserved in the mud, displaying remarkable detail, even skin ridges that resembled human fingerprints. The spacing between them measured nearly 5 feet, indicating an incredibly long stride and a bipedal gait. The logical side of Damien's mind searched for rational explanations. Could it be a hoax? The remote location made that unlikely. Who would trek 20 miles into the wilderness just to prank a lone surveyor who might never even find the tracks? Could it belong to an animal he'd misidentified? His field experience and knowledge of wildlife ruled that out. Could someone have faked it with prosthetic molds or modified footwear? Again, the depth and anatomical detail of the prints suggested genuine weight and structure, something alive and immensely powerful. As Damien packed up his gear and prepared to hike toward his second survey site, he found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, straining to catch every sound in the forest. The rational scientist in him insisted there had to be a logical explanation, but a deeper, more primal part of his brain screamed a warning. Something was very wrong here. The second site. The next survey point lay 3 miles deeper into the forest, following a ridge line that eventually descended into the isolated valley where most of his work was focused. The trail grew faint as Damien climbed higher, until it finally vanished altogether. From then on, he relied solely on his compass and GPS coordinates. The forest here felt older, more ancient, and untouched than anywhere he had ever worked near a road. The trees were enormous, their trunks so wide that his camera couldn't capture their true scale no matter how far he stepped back. By mid-morning, Damien stopped to check his position and rest his aching shoulders. That was when he noticed something that made his skin prickle. The forest was completely silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving behind a suffocating, eerie stillness. From years in the field, Damien knew that kind of silence usually meant only one thing: the presence of a large predator nearby, something that had driven all other wildlife into hiding. He He quietly unlatched his rifle, chambered around, and kept the safety on but ready to disengage in an instant. His eyes swept the forest around him, scanning for any flicker of movement, any unnatural shape among the trees. The discovery, the dense undergrowth limited Damien's visibility, creating dozens of potential hiding places for whatever might be watching him. The sense of being observed was overwhelming, an instinctive, primal awareness that something out there was studying him from the darkness. He moved more carefully now, pressing forward toward his next survey point but never letting his guard down. Every snapping twig made him freeze and listen. Every shadow drew his eyes. The weight of his pack felt heavier than before, and he slowed his pace to evaluate every possible threat. The GPS showed he was still 2 miles from his destination, but the terrain was growing steeper and more treacherous. By midday, Damien crested a ridge and stopped cold. Below him stretched a narrow valley that didn't appear on any of his maps. The depression was about half a mile wide and a mile long, densely forested, with what looked like a clearing in the center. A small stream caught glints of sunlight between the trees, yet the whole place seemed wrong. It felt hidden, secret, a place humans weren't meant to find. More troubling still, even from this height, Damien could smell something carried on the wind, a musky, organic odor mixed with the unmistakable sweetness of rot. It was faint but persistent, unlike anything he'd encountered in years of fieldwork. The scent provoked an involuntary revulsion deep in his gut, an animal warning that made him want to turn back to his truck immediately. But the GPS coordinates for his assignment led straight through the valley, and Damien Holbrook had never abandoned a job because of fear or discomfort. He raised his camera, photographing the scene from his vantage point and marking the approximate position of the clearing on his map. According to his instruments, the strongest mineral readings came from the very center of the valley, exactly where his next survey site would be. Descending into the valley took over an hour. Damien picked his way down steep slopes covered with loose rock and tangled vegetation, forced to backtrack several times when sheer cliffs or impassable terrain blocked his route. The deeper he went, the denser and more oppressive the forest became. Massive fallen logs formed a maze of obstacles he had to climb over or crawl beneath. The smell grew stronger with every step, evolving from a faint mustiness into something that made his eyes water and his stomach churn. It wasn't the natural earthy scent of normal forest decay. It was something else, heavier, fouler, more complex. Now it carried sharp notes of urine, feces, and something that might have been rotting fish. Damien found himself breathing through his mouth just to keep from gagging. When he finally reached the valley floor, the source of the stench became horrifyingly clear. He stepped out of the trees into a circular clearing nearly 200 yards across, and in that instant, he understood he had walked into something far more dangerous than a mineral site. The clearing was strewn with bones, hundreds of them scattered in rough piles and lines across the forest floor. Deer skulls, elk rib cages, what might have been bear femurs, and dozens of smaller bones from animals he couldn't immediately identify. But it was the arrangement that froze his blood. The bones weren't randomly scattered, as they would be at a natural die-off or a predator's feeding ground. They had been deliberately placed in patterns of circles, lines, and stacked formations that hinted at intelligent organization. Some bones had been cracked open, likely for marrow extraction, while others seemed positioned purely for display. At the center of the clearing stood a structure unlike anything Damien had ever seen. Built from massive logs, some nearly 3 feet thick, it resembled a primitive shelter or den, but on a scale beyond human ability without machinery. The logs were stacked into a rough conical shape, forming a hollow interior large enough to hold something enormous. Fresh scratches along the wood suggested ongoing use and maintenance. Damien approached the structure with utmost caution, rifle in hand, safety still on but ready to disengage at a moment's notice. The smell here was almost unbearable. A dense concentration of the valley's foul odor mixed with something that reminded him of a zoo's primate enclosure. Dark stains covered the logs around the entrance, and flies swarmed in thick black clouds over what looked like fresh organic matter. Inside, the beam of Damien's flashlight revealed a sight that would haunt him for years. The floor was layered with bones, these far fresher, bearing clear evidence of recent feeding. Strips of meat still clung to some ribs. Pools of coagulated blood marked the ground where something had fed. But what made his stomach twist where the non-animal remains mixed among them. Torn fabric, clearly human in origin, was scattered across the ground. A hiking boot, still containing what might have been the bones of a foot. Shredded remains of a backpack, its nylon fibers ripped apart as if by enormous claws. A digital camera, crushed beyond repair but still recognizable. And leaning against the far wall, a human skull, its jaw torn away, deep fractures running across the bone. Damien staggered backward out of the structure, choking on nausea and terror. This wasn't just a predator's den. It was a feeding ground. The hunt? It was a feeding ground, a place where some creature had been bringing both animal and human prey for a very long time. The arrangement of the bones, the construction of the shelter, the sheer scale of everything pointed to an intelligence far beyond any known animal. Yet the savagery of the feeding behavior suggested something completely outside human experience. As Damien stood in the clearing, struggling to process what he had just discovered, a sound rose from the distant forest that made his blood turn to ice. It was a vocalization unlike anything he had ever heard, part roar, part howl, and something disturbingly close to human speech. The sound was enormous, a deep resonance that vibrated in his chest. And it was getting closer. Damian ran. All thoughts of scientific observation and professional duty vanished as pure animal terror seized control. He sprinted across the clearing, crashed into the underbrush at the forest's edge, and began clawing his way up the steep valley wall with desperate urgency. Behind him, the calls continued, now coming from multiple directions. Whatever lived in that valley was not alone, and it had discovered him. The climb became a waking nightmare, dense vegetation, loose rock, muscles screaming in exhaustion. His pack snagged on branches and nearly pulled him backward more than once, but he didn't dare stop to fix it. Every instinct screamed, "Keep moving." The sounds behind him grew louder, heavy bodies crashing through the forest in pursuit. Branches snapped like gunfire, and amid the chaos he could hear breathing deep, rhythmic, impossibly powerful. Halfway up the slope, Damien made the mistake of looking back. Through gaps in the canopy below, he saw movement huge, dark shapes gliding through the clearing littered with bones. One of them broke away from the rest and began climbing after him, moving with fluid, terrifying grace, as though it had made this ascent 1,000 times before. Even at a distance, Damien could see it scale 8 to 9 feet tall, proportioned like an impossibly muscular human. Fear gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He reached the ridge in half the time it had taken him to descend, lungs on fire, legs trembling violently. The sounds of pursuit continued behind him, but they seemed to fade slightly. Either his pursuers were slowing down, or they were reluctant to stray too far from their den. At the ridgetop, Damien stopped just long enough to check his GPS. His position showed he was still more than 15 miles from the logging road, and between him and safety lay some of the roughest terrain in the Olympic wilderness. His water was nearly gone. His food supply, planned for 3 days of normal field work, would barely sustain him through a single desperate night on the run. As he descended the far side of the ridge, the truth hit him with grim clarity. His ordeal wasn't over. The creatures from the valley clearly regarded this entire forest as their territory, and Damien was still deep inside it. Every tree shadow could hide a watcher. Every noise could signal pursuit. The afternoon became a blur of frantic movement and moments of frozen dread, when the rustle of branches or a distant thud made him stop and listen, convinced he wasn't alone. He pushed himself harder than he ever had in his life, covering ground at an astonishing pace for normal conditions, yet it felt painfully, impossibly slow compared to the things that hunted him. By 4 p.m., when he finally paused to catch his breath and check his position, he heard the sounds again. They were faint but distinct, coming from multiple directions, as if the creatures were spreading out, coordinating. The pattern was deliberate. The calls weren't random roars or animal noises anymore. They had rhythm, structure, communication. A cold realization settled over Damien as his rational mind fought to stay functional. He was still 12 miles from his truck. The sun would set in less than 3 hours. And something out there, something intelligent, powerful, and territorial, was hunting him across terrain it knew far better than he ever could. The night hunt. His rifle held 5 rounds, plus 1 chambered, but Damien had no idea whether standard ammunition would have any effect on the towering creatures he had seen. His radio was useless this deep in the mountains, and no one would even think to look for him for at least 2 more days. The most logical option was to find a defensible position and wait for daylight. But the thought of trying to sleep in the open forest while those things searched for him was unbearable. Damien decided to keep moving for as long as possible, hoping to reach an area closer to civilization before exhaustion forced him to stop. As darkness began to fall, the forest changed. He started noticing strange claw marks on the trees, just like the ones he had seen near his first campsite. Some were fresh, the exposed wood still pale where the bark had been ripped away. Others were older, weathered over time, but clearly made by the same kind of claws. These weren't random scratches. They were deliberate territorial markers, warnings for other creatures to stay clear of an established hunting ground. Worse still were the trees that had been completely destroyed. Enormous Douglas firs and pines lay snapped across the trail, broken off 10 to 12 feet above the ground, as if something had gripped them and twisted until they shattered. The spiral fractures showed immense torsional force, far beyond what any known animal could produce. Wind damage was impossible. The destruction was too selective, the break patterns too deliberate. By 6 p.m., Damien heard the sounds again. The pursuit had returned closer this time, coming from behind him and from both sides, as if whatever hunted him could triangulate his position. He veered east to throw them off, but the sounds shifted accordingly, maintaining the same 3-point formation around him. Whatever was following him was intelligent, smart enough to coordinate its movements and adjust to his direction. The realization that he was being hunted by something capable of strategy pushed his fear to a new, almost paralyzing level. Wild animals could be avoided through understanding their behavior, but intelligent hunters could adapt, plan, and counter any move he made. He wasn't being stalked by beasts. He was being hunted by something that could think. As full darkness descended, Damien made a decision that may have saved his life. Instead of continuing along the clear route that led back to his truck, he cut south, beginning a brutal climb toward a rock outcrop he'd seen earlier on his topographical maps. The detour would add miles to his journey and carry him farther from human habitation, but it might also throw off whatever tracking method his pursuers were using. The climb was brutal in the fading light. Loose shale and exposed rock made every step a gamble. One misstep could send him tumbling to his death. But the rugged terrain also offered an advantage. His tracks would be harder to follow, and the elevation gave him a better view of the land below. From the ridge, Damien looked back toward the valley he had fled that morning. In the distance, fires were burning too many, too large, and too organized to be natural. Orange light flickered through the forest canopy, illuminating shapes moving between the flames. Every so often, he caught sight of a dark silhouette that confirmed his worst fears. The creatures were enormous, 8 to 10 feet tall, walking upright with frighteningly human posture. More fires appeared along the ridges surrounding the valley, forming a jagged ring that seemed to be spreading outward. And then the realization struck him like ice water. This wasn't chaos. It was a coordinated search, a sweep conducted by intelligent beings using fire as a tool. They weren't randomly hunting. They were systematically hurting him, closing off escape routes, pushing him toward a trap. Damien lifted his binoculars with trembling hands, trying to get a clearer view. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The creatures were covered in thick, black hair or fur, their bodies and limbs corded with muscle. Their faces were a disturbing fusion of human and ape-like features, a direct affront to every assumption he had ever held about evolution. Their sheer presence radiated power, raw, ancient, and purposeful. The Watchers. They moved upright, balanced perfectly on 2 legs, using their hands to manipulate tools and fire. Their movements, coordination, and the deliberate structure of their actions revealed a complex social order, something far beyond instinct. But it was their eyes that truly terrified him. Even from a distance, even through the haze of flame and smoke, Damien could see the reflection of intelligence staring back at him. These were not beasts ruled by primal urges. They were thinking beings capable of planning, reasoning, and adapting their strategies. And right now, every ounce of that intelligence was focused on finding him. Damien spent the night curled between the cold rocks, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. The temperature dropped below freezing, and his breath rose in trembling clouds against the frigid air. He had lost his sleeping bag during his desperate escape from the valley, and his clothes meant for routine field work not mountain survival, offered little protection. As the hours crawled by, hypothermia became a very real threat. His body heat seeped into the stone beneath him until every muscle ached with cold. Below, the search continued. The fires moved across the valley in disciplined, coordinated patterns, sweeping through the forest and along the slopes. Every few minutes he heard calls echoing through the darkness, strange, complex vocalizations that sounded less like animal communication and more like language. More than once, Damien thought he saw shapes moving against the starlit sky, figures, scaling ridges, crossing open ground, closing the distance between them. By 3 a.m., exhaustion finally overpowered fear, and he drifted into a shallow, nightmare-ridden sleep. He dreamed of towering shapes moving through endless forests, eyes glinting in the dark, branches clawing at him as he fled through a maze of trees that all led back to that terrible clearing of bones. He woke with a start to the gray light of dawn and the sound of something massive moving among the rocks below. Damien slowly leaned forward and peered over the edge of his hiding place. His heart froze. Less than 50 yards away, a creature was methodically searching the rocky slope, clearly tracking his scent from the night before. It moved with deliberate precision, stopping every few steps to examine the ground and sniff the air. Up close, it was even more horrifying than what he had seen from afar. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human's and arms so long they nearly reached its knees. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, but its face was disturbingly human beneath the heavy brow ridge, and massive jawline lurked a grim intelligence. The most unsettling detail was its hands, dexterous, with opposable thumbs, the skin calloused from what looked like years of tool use. This wasn't a wild animal scavenging for food. It was tracking him with the patience and skill of an experienced hunter. Damien watched in silent terror as it paused at every displaced stone, every scuffed mark on the dirt, studying each with eerie focus as if analyzing evidence. Several times it looked directly toward his hiding place, and Damien was sure it knew exactly where he was. But it didn't rush him. It was waiting for him to panic, to move, to make a mistake. 20 minutes crawled by like hours. The creature continued its methodical search, circling slowly, testing the wind. Damien didn't dare move. His body was stiff and cramping, his breath shallow, his rifle raised and trained on the creature's chest. He knew the weapon would wound it, maybe even kill it, but he also knew the gunshot would echo through the valley, drawing the others. Unless it attacked, he wouldn't fire. At last, the creature turned away, descending the slope toward the valley below. Damien watched it vanish among the trees, only to spot others farther off, all moving systematically through the terrain. They hadn't given up. Their search was organized, precise, and terrifyingly thorough, more like a coordinated military operation than a chase. To them, this hunt wasn't a matter of instinct. It was a problem to be solved. Damien waited until the last of the creatures disappeared from sight before daring to move. His muscles screamed in protest as he crawled out from the rocks, stiff from the cold and the cramped position. His canteen was nearly empty, and the thirst clawing at his throat matched the exhaustion in his body. He was alive for now, but deep down, he knew the hunt wasn't over. The trap, according to the GPS, Damien was still 8 miles from his truck. Between him and safety lay steep terrain, blind valleys, and countless opportunities for an ambush. The morning trek became a nightmare of vigilance, a constant effort to choose his path carefully while staying alert for every possible danger. He avoided open ridges and clear trails where his silhouette could be outlined against the sky. Instead, he crept through dense brush, moving from cover to cover like a soldier behind enemy lines. Every few hundred yards, he stopped and listened. His heart pounded as he strained to separate the natural sounds of the forest from the faint, unnatural ones that suggested pursuit. Around midday, Damien stumbled upon something that confirmed his worst fears about the intelligence of the things hunting him. A fallen log stretched across a creek, clearly modified. Fresh tool marks scored the wood, the cuts clean and deliberate, forming a makeshift bridge. The work had been done recently, perhaps that very morning, and the bridge lay directly along the most efficient route back to his truck. They weren't just chasing him at random. They were anticipating his movements, setting traps. From that moment on, Damien abandoned any attempt to take the direct path to safety. Instead, he veered east, toward a secondary logging road marked faintly on his map. It would add several miles to his journey, but it might keep him off the routes the creatures expected him to use. The detour led him through some of the roughest terrain he had ever encountered: sheer cliffs, slick rock faces, and steep ravines that required climbing rather than hiking. His arms burned from exhaustion, and the weight of his pack felt unbearable, but the rugged landscape at least offered one advantage: it would make his trail harder to follow. During the long detour, Damien discovered chilling new evidence. In a sheltered ravine, he came across another apparent feeding site, a clearing where bones had been piled and arranged just like in the valley den. But these remains were older. Many of the bones had turned white and brittle from years of exposure. Mixed among the animal remains were human artifacts: a rusted belt buckle, corroded coins, fragments of camping gear that looked decades old. Some items even predated modern outdoor equipment. The implications were staggering. These creatures had been hunting humans in the Olympic Mountains for generations, perhaps for decades or longer. They had established territory, developed hunting strategies, and built a kind of infrastructure to support their operations. The missing hikers, hunters, and loggers the rangers occasionally wrote off as lost to the wilderness hadn't vanished by accident. They had been taken by intelligent predators who had perfected the art of hunting people. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees grew smaller, the signs of selective logging more apparent. Damien recognized familiar landmarks from previous surveys. His GPS confirmed he was now less than 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, from the road where he had parked. Relief washed over him too soon. When he reached the crest of a ridge that should have given him a clear view of the valley and the final stretch to his truck, he froze. Smoke. Not the thin, white smoke of a campfire, but thick, black smoke, the kind that comes from burning oil and fuel. Damien's stomach turned to ice. Through his binoculars, he saw what he had dreaded most. His Ford F-150 was gone, crushed, mangled, and scorched. It looked as if it had been rolled down the slope and set ablaze. The flames had long since died, leaving only a twisted, smoldering shell. His keys, radio, emergency gear, everything was gone. His only way back to civilization had been destroyed. It wasn't random, it was strategic. The creatures hadn't just hunted him through the forest, they had anticipated his destination and cut off his escape. They understood that destroying his vehicle would strand him deep in their territory, turning him from an intruder into prey with no way out. Damien forced himself to think logically, despite the panic clawing at his mind. He was now more than 20 miles from the nearest accessible road. He had no radio, no vehicle, and almost no supplies. His water was nearly gone, and he had maybe a day's worth of food left. His strength was fading rapidly from exhaustion and stress. The nearest human settlement, the Ho Ranger Station, lay back to the west, directly through the territory he had barely escaped alive. The only remaining option was to keep heading east, toward the old logging roads. If he was lucky, he might find a work crew or at least some sign of other people before his supplies or his luck ran out. As the second night fell over the mountains, Damien made a hard decision. He would keep moving rather than risk another night exposed. The creatures had already proven their ability to coordinate, to search systematically, and to lay traps. Staying in one place would only make him easier to find. His only advantage now was mobility, and he intended to use it. Traveling by night was slow and treacherous. Damien used his flashlight sparingly, switching it on only when the terrain became too dangerous to navigate in darkness. Most of the time, he moved under the dim light of the moon and stars, his boots crunching softly on frost-covered ground. More than once, he nearly stepped into hidden ravines or slipped from unseen cliffs. The darkness pressed close around him, heavy and alive, as the forest seemed to breathe with unseen watchers. Every step carried him deeper into the unknown, and closer to whatever waited in the darkness ahead. The return in for 7. The alternative, being caught in daylight by organized hunters, seemed far worse than the dangers of navigating through the night. Around midnight, Damien began hearing them again. The calls were distant but unmistakable, echoing from multiple directions. As the search resumed, the sounds interwove calls and responses, as though the creatures were coordinating across vast stretches of forest. He was still being hunted. As the night wore on, Damien's condition deteriorated rapidly. Dehydration became a serious threat, and his body burned through its remaining energy reserves at a dangerous pace. Constant adrenaline left him shaking and disoriented, making it harder to keep his bearings and increasing the risk of a fall or injury that would leave him helpless. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the psychological torment. Knowing he was being pursued by intelligent predators, creatures that had killed before and would kill him if given the chance, was an agony beyond anything he had ever imagined. Every shadow could conceal a watcher. Every sound could signal pursuit. There was no safe place to rest, no moment of relief. By dawn, Damien was staggering through a second-growth forest that showed signs of recent logging. Cut stumps and skid marks marked the presence of humans, and for the first time since discovering the feeding ground, he felt the faint flicker of hope. His GPS indicated that he was still 12 miles, 19 kilometers, from the ranger station. But the terrain was more familiar now, less wild, less alien. Then, from behind him, half a mile away, came a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It wasn't a growl or a howl this time, it was speech, a deep, resonant voice filled with complex tones and rhythm, unmistakably communicative yet utterly inhuman. Two more voices answered from different directions, confirming what Damien already knew. They were still following him. But there was something different about these calls, now an urgency, an edge of frenzied determination. They knew he was escaping their territory, and they were closing in for one final hunt. Driven by pure desperation, Damien ran. His legs felt like rubber, his lungs burned with every breath, and his vision blurred from exhaustion and dehydration. But behind him, the forest erupted with the sounds of pursuit, snapping branches, heavy footfalls, and the deep, mechanical rhythm of breathing that sounded like steam engines in the dark. Then, through the trees ahead, Damien saw salvation, a logging road. Fresh tire tracks pressed into the mud signs of recent human activity, and faint exhaust haze still clung to the vegetation. It was the first undeniable proof of civilization he'd seen in 2 days. He stumbled onto the gravel road, barely able to stand, and began walking, then half running, toward what he prayed would be safety, rescue, and an end to the nightmare. But even here, under open sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. The calls had stopped, but the silence was worse, a suffocating stillness that seemed to press against his back. More than once, he thought he saw movement in the tree-lined dark shapes pacing him from a distance. Near noon, Damien finally encountered another human being. A Forest Service truck rounded a bend ahead. Damien stumbled into the road, waving both arms wildly, shouting for help. The vehicle braked hard, tires crunching on the gravel. A ranger jumped out, eyes wide in shock. "Jesus, you look terrible," the man said, taking in Damien's filthy clothes, hollowed eyes, and trembling hands. "What happened to you?" Damien tried to explain, but the words tumbled out incoherently, a flood of technical terms, panic, and fragmented horror. He spoke of the valley, the feeding ground, the intelligent predators, the destroyed truck, and the decades of hidden hunts in the Olympic wilderness. The ranger listened, frowning, clearly unsure whether he was dealing with a man in shock or one suffering from delusion brought on by exposure. "Let's get you to a hospital first," the ranger said gently. "We'll figure the rest out after you've seen a doctor." The drive back to Port Angeles blurred into chaos for fluids, medical examinations, and a storm of questions from law enforcement and doctors. Damien's conditions, severe dehydration, exhaustion, lacerations, and bruising confirmed that he had survived something extreme. But his story of coordinated, intelligent predators was met only with polite disbelief. Over the following days, search teams investigated his claims. They found his destroyed truck, exactly as he described, its condition consistent with deliberate sabotage rather than accident. They located his disturbed campsite and even uncovered several unusual footprints which matched the photos Damien had taken. But when the teams reached the valley, everything was gone. The clearing had been wiped clean. The piles of bones, the massive log structure, all of it had been dismantled and removed. Even the stench had vanished. All that remained were a few disturbed patches of soil and faint claw marks on nearby trees. It was as if the creatures had known an investigation was coming and had erased every trace of their existence. Epilogue: the hunters remain. Wildlife can behave unpredictably during the mating season, one ranger explained during the press briefing. And Stress can cause people to see things that aren't really there. You went through a traumatic experience, Mr. Holbrook, but there's no evidence of any undiscovered species in the Olympic Mountains. The official report classified Damien's ordeal as a complex wilderness accident resulting from exposure and psychological stress. His destroyed truck was attributed to vandalism, possibly the work of local teens who drove another vehicle to the remote site. The mysterious footprints, investigators claimed, were misidentified bear tracks, distorted by soil and erosion. But Damien knew what he had seen, what he had lived through, and what was still out there. The creatures were real. They were intelligent, and they were still hunting. The way the feeding ground had been cleared proved one chilling fact. They understood the need to hide the evidence, to cover their tracks, to stay unseen. In the months that followed, Damien tried to resume a normal life and career, but the experience had changed him forever. He could no longer work alone in remote areas. He could no longer sleep without checking the locks twice. He found himself scanning the tree line whenever he walked outdoors, searching for the faint, impossible imprint of watchful eyes. Every news report about a missing hiker or an unexplained disappearance twisted a knife in his gut. Were they taking more victims? Was the hunt continuing, hidden beneath the polite lies of lost and unaccounted for? He reached out to journalists, to scientists, to anyone who might listen. But his story was too extraordinary, his evidence too circumstantial. The academics dismissed him as a man unhinged by trauma. Law enforcement had more practical problems. To the public, monsters belonged in myths, not in modern forests. Eventually, Damien abandoned fieldwork altogether. He took a teaching position at a community college in Seattle, lecturing on earth sciences safe, contained, and far from the wilderness that haunted him. The classroom was predictable. The city felt solid beneath his feet. And yet, even there, the shadows still moved. Sometimes, in the reflection of a window, he'd glimpse shapes walking the wrong direction. At night, he'd hear sounds that didn't belong, low, deliberate, almost conversational, and feel that old, primal certainty creeping back. Something was watching him. When sleep refused to come, Damien would spread out maps of the Olympic Peninsula, tracing the river valleys and ridgelines by lamplight, wondering how many feeding sites might still exist in that vast, unmapped wilderness. How many missing hikers were really taken victims of a species humanity refused to acknowledge? How many hunters and campers had vanished into those ancient woods, never realizing whose territory they had entered? The official story was tidy and clear. Damien Holbrook, geologist, had suffered exposure, hallucinations, and delusions following a wilderness accident. His truck had been vandalized. The footprints were bear tracks, and the valley he described had never existed. The Olympic Mountains remained a pristine wilderness, where the only real dangers were weather, terrain, and the occasional black bear. But deep in those forests where the old-growth trees blot out the sun and no human trail endures, something else still hunts. The beings that stalked Damien during those 48 hours of terror are still out there, clever, organized, and hungry. They have learned to hide their evidence, to erase their presence, and to choose their victims from the unseen margins of society. And sometimes, on still moonlit nights, hikers on the Olympic slopes report strange sounds, not quite animal, but not human either. Rhythmic, structured, haunting, as if language itself were echoing from the dark. Those reports are filed away with other unexplained phenomena, dismissed as tricks of the wind or the imagination of people who spend too much time alone in the woods. But the truth remains, buried in the places where maps end and human understanding fails. The truth waits in the clearings that can be dismantled overnight, guarded by creatures intelligent enough to understand the power of secrecy and patient enough to wait for the perfect prey. Because the truth is this: humanity is not alone, and some of the other intelligent species on this planet have no interest in coexistence. They remember a time long before cities and technology when the balance of power was simpler: predator and prey, hunter and hunted, intelligence and terror. Damien Holbrook knows that truth. He carries it with him every day, and he knows he will never be safe, not while those things still move through the forests between what humans think they know and the reality that waits in the dark. The feeding ground may be gone, the evidence erased, the official story written, but in the heart of the Olympic Mountains, Something still hunts, still kills, still learns. The den was found once. What lived inside was beyond comprehension, and those who built it are still free, still perfecting their craft deep within a wilderness where few dare to go, and fewer still return to tell the story. The encounter has ended. The hunt has not. And one day, when the creatures in the dark decide that hiding is no longer necessary, humanity will learn the same truth. Damien Holbrook discovered in those 48 hours of terror that mankind's claim to the top of the food chain was only ever an illusion. For in the forgotten depths of the earth, the older, hungrier predators are still waiting, ready to reclaim what was once theirs.